Hi all, I'm Trish Chapman with the State Coastal Conservancy, and thank you for joining us today. We're just gonna give it probably 2 more minutes while we wait for people to sign on. There's a lot of people joining us right now, so hold tight. All right, it seems like the speed of people joining has slowed down, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Trish Chapman. I'm the Central Coast Manager for the State Coastal Conservancy, and the Conservancy is very happy to host today's webinar on cutting green tape. And Kellyx Nelson, Executive Director of the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, and Jim Robbins, the Principal of Alness Ecological, will be leading this webinar for you, and I'll just pass it off to Kellyx now. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Trish. Good morning, everyone. I wish I could see you. It's nice to know that you're out there and that there's so much interest in this topic. I wish, of course, that we were all in the same room and having a chance to mingle and have, eye contact. But I'm glad that we're here today in this capacity as well. And maybe the silver lining of meeting this way is that it's easier for more people to join from different places. Today's webinar is about cutting green tape, specifically focusing on the report that was released in November that has a series of recommendations for regulatory efficiencies to accomplish restoration and stewardship of California's natural resources. So while people are still gathering, looks like we've got about 100 people. I'm going to go ahead and scroll to the next slide and just cover a couple of logistics. One is that if you want to pose questions at any time, click on the questions bar and your questions will go to the organizers and then we will answer those as time allows. And we do have time slotted at the end of the webinar for Q&A after Jim and I present to you today. And we're also going to be doing 2 polls during this meeting to get to know who's here a little bit and what's on your mind a little bit. And so I'm going to ask you to take a moment right now and either open a new window or use your phone and go to this website, this Poll Everywhere website. And then Trish, if it's possible for you to put that in the chat as well for anybody who wants to cut and paste from there. I'm going to ask folks, go ahead and go to that website and you'll see a map. And if you could start entering in that map your primary affiliation, that's where you work. Or you could just say where you're sitting and working today. And if you do statewide work, pick a place that a lot of your energy and focus is right now. So Trish, if you're able to put that in the chat box, I am going to.
I did put it in the chat box.
Thank you. I am going to go ahead and open that. That's right now. So let's see, you see a lot of, wow, from the very north to the very southern ends of the state. Definitely a few folks from LA and San Diego and along the Central Coast. Looks like a lot around the Bay Area from Monterey as well, and a nice cluster there around Sacramento and Central Valley. Some North Coast folks. Some joining us looks like from Oregon. That's great. I'll give that another minute to get a sense of who's joining us today. So, oh, wow. So it looks like someone's joining us from a boat in the middle of the ocean. Some folks in the Sierras, around Tahoe, Arizona. Great. Nice, diverse representation here. So good to quote unquote see you all. And I'm gonna then switch back over to this presentation and a little bit about your presenters today. We are aware that this is an unusual professional photo to represent who your presenters are, but we thought it kind of spoke to the type of process that Cutting Green Tape is involved, which has been extremely collaborative, very much about connecting as individuals around shared purpose, and not just business as usual. My name is Kellyx Nelson. I worked on this under the umbrella of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, where I chair the Regulatory Efficiencies Working Group. And I'm also the executive director of the Resource Conservation District in San Mateo County, and on the board of directors of the California Association of RCDs. And then Jim Robbins, who's joining us, is the principal of Alness Ecological Consulting, and he was also working on this through the auspices of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And Jim and I were among the authors of the paper with the recommendations, and happy to present on those and answer some of your questions about that today. So let me go to a little bit of what we're going to do today. So we're going to give an overview of Cutting Green Tape, what the need is, the process, the recommendations, the road ahead. There's some time for Q&A, maybe some discussion, some closing remarks, and we're hoping to wrap this up a little bit early for you. We know that it's hard for some people to be able to do a full hour and a half, but if there's enough questions, we'll definitely stick it out to the end and do that. So without further ado, why don't I go ahead and talk about the need for cutting green tape. I think all of us on this webinar love nature. We're thrilled by wildlife. We connect deeply to outdoor spaces. We're inspired by thriving forests, clean rivers, beaches. Probably all of us know that California's economy and people from all walks of life throughout the state depend on healthy soils, clean air, water resources, biodiversity that functioning ecosystems provide. And it doesn't come as a surprise to any of us that we face major challenges and an existential crisis right now with climate change and biodiversity loss. We know that we need to do more restoration, and we need to do it now. It's not enough to fence off these spaces that remain intact. And we have to actively undo some of the damage that we've done. We have to actively manage land, because even if it is fenced off, it's still being altered by climate change, invasive species, wildfires, and more. And I personally believe that our ability to meet this moment requires courage, a lot of courage. We need to take truly ambitious action to work more efficiently, more effectively, more quickly, and frankly, at the pace and scale that is commensurate with the pace and scale of the threats that are actively marching forward. Some of you may have heard Secretary Crowfoot say on climate change, winning slowly is actually losing. We have to keep up with the rate of change and disruption. And then in October, Governor Newsom issued an executive order recognizing the biodiversity crisis and laying out an ambitious strategy for California that specifically identifies cutting green tape. So in the interests of accomplishing those goals and ensuring effective investments of California dollars and taxpayers' initiatives to vote to tax themselves to get restoration done. With all of that in mind, today we're going to talk a little bit about this process that developed the recommendations in the report that hopefully by now most or all of you have seen or have some familiarity with, or at least know that it exists. And if not, we'll fill you in more about that today. So the California Landscape Stewardship Network started coming together in 2016 to address large pressing challenges that required that we work together in new ways, across boundaries and at a scale to manage and care for our lands, addressing the barriers that we face to landscape scale stewardship. The California Landscape Stewardship Network is a network of networks. It's a collaboration of partnerships from across the state that collectively covers about 40% of the geography of California. Southern Sierras, Orange County coast, Santa Cruz Mountains, Tahoe, North Coast, Bay Area, and beyond. In 2019, we published a white paper that reviewed and assessed some of the significant efforts to date to reduce regulatory barriers to restoration. That paper is on the network's website, which I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. And in that paper, we posed the idea of shifting our risk paradigm, that environmental regulations are in general a better tool for stopping bad actions than they are for advancing environmentally beneficial actions. They stop the bad, but they don't enable the good. Almost by definition, these regulatory tools consider taking action to be a risk. That's how they were developed. And so we posed the idea that we've entered a new era in which delayed actions or insufficient action is also a risk. And we posed a question we need to ask is whether the very real risks of unintended consequences of doing restoration, that we might do something wrong or there might be an outcome we hadn't anticipated, whether that risk outweighs the risks of delayed, costly, reduced restoration or restoration that doesn't happen. We met with Secretary Crowfoot about this and about the network, and he really connected with the immediate need for regulatory efficiencies. The idea that we could improve our regulations, our processes, and our policies so that environmental stewardship can occur more quickly, simply, and cost effectively. We hope to optimize funding and significant investments that the state is making and taxpayers are making to have the kinds of outcomes that were desired. And we also hope to accomplish what are actually the priorities, not just what is most feasible within a grant timeline or window or what have you. So Cutting Green Tape was born as an interagency effort anchored in the California Natural Resources Agency under the leadership of Secretary Wade Crowfoot. In 2002, former Resources Secretary Mary Nichols launched a task force on removing regulatory barriers to restoration that resulted in a list of recommendations and a number of efficiencies that have really moved the dial, like CEQA exemptions for small-scale habitat restoration, for example. There's been a lot of work by Sustainable Conservation, our partner, and many others. There are different collaboratives that have formed to try to get interagency collaboration with project applicants, from the Integrated Watershed Restoration Program of the Central Coast to BRIT in the Bay Area, some folks on the North Coast, etc. California Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Water Resources Control Board have undertaken some significant investments in trying to focus on getting restoration done in recent years. And many of the recommendations in this process directly support or build on that previous work. So over the course of a year, we held 3 roundtables and dozens of phone calls engaging over 150 people from environmental nonprofits, restoration practitioners and advocacy groups, large landowner groups, public and private land managers, local, state, and federal governments, tribes, water utilities, working lands, businesses, etc. And we focused really on the shared purpose of environmental benefit, not getting so much bogged down by the different perspectives or responsibilities that we all have in that space. And there was a solid understanding that environmental regulations and laws exist for a reason, and that there are legitimate concerns about reducing environmental protections. And this is definitely not about reducing any environmental protections, but wanting to improve the effectiveness and efficiency and ensure that good environmental practices can happen, and that agency staff who implement those regulations can meaningfully participate in environmental restoration and stewardship. So these stakeholders, Jim may have mentioned this while I was disconnected, identified 45 potential actions that form the basis of the recommendations in our report. So I want to also explain what the report is and what the recommendations are not. So the recommendations, because Secretary Crowfoot really created this opportunity for us and prioritized this issue for his administration, our report focuses on what can be done at the state level. It doesn't have recommendations regarding federal permitting, and it focuses on environmental regulations, not like SHPO or cultural regulations or other things. It also focuses on projects that are for the purpose of environmental benefit, not other public goods or other natural resource related projects about maybe access or trails or fire or what have you. And the recommendations are at intentionally different scales. Some are more aspirational, some are an interpretation, some are calling for incremental improvements, some are expanding on something that exists, some are a whole new vision. So they did include extensive input from a wide range of people, as we mentioned before, and that includes regulatory agency staff who have the challenging and essential role in protecting California's most sensitive and imperiled natural resources. And so it's our hope that these recommendations individually and collectively help empower agency staff and practitioners to work together to accomplish things more efficiently and effectively. I want to note and flag that when multiple approaches were recommended for the same end goal, it was our default to advance recommendations that were rooted in empowering agency staff to own solutions. So for example, if there is something that could be an interpretation, or it could be legislation, or it could be a programmatic approach, or what have you, we defaulted to something that could be owned more broadly and not have legislation as the first solution. There are legislative recommendations where that was what was required and needed. And that we typically, well, that's enough of that. I want to show a slide, but I'm kind of afraid. That'll make things.
I'd love you to try because it'll tee me up.
Okay, I'm going to try to show this slide. So it was, okay, everybody out there in the ether, fingers crossed.
I swear that I won't be looking at our faces across the screen either.
Okay, can you see this screen? You can? Okay. So don't worry if you don't understand what is on the screen, or if it looks messy, or you wish I would make it larger, you wish we'd write more clearly. It's intentionally messy. And this is sort of lifting the lid and giving a peek into our brains about how we tried to integrate all of the different types of recommendations that people gave, particularly since so many of them were interconnected. And I think the bottom line here is that there were, of these 45 recommendations, many were similar or overlapping or had slightly different approaches to the same issue, had many complex interactions. Some had redundancies, some had linkages. What we landed on in that paper was our best reflection of what we heard from the stakeholders throughout this process. This was a particular point in time. This report represents some vetted recommendations, but it is not the sum total of ways that we can improve how we deliver restoration and landscape stewardship. There is still a lot to be done and many people working in this space. This represents a particular body of thinking. So Jim is going to go into those a little bit, and before he kind of goes through the recommendations, I want to flag that By far the most frequent recommendation that came up across all stakeholder groups, regardless of how they work, was that we need to have effective inter and intra-agency coordination to develop, fund, and permit projects. It was such a global comment that we actually didn't have that as a standalone recommendation. And we recognize that there are a number of collaborative efforts moving forward right now. Some address a particular region or a particular outcome or particular stakeholders. And but there's not a ton yet known about how well they're working or what they're accomplishing. So I think something moving forward that we're going to do is learn lessons learned from these different efforts. And the other note is that the recommendations were explicitly not a prioritization exercise. This wasn't everybody in the state agreeing to what's the most important thing to do, because different people can tackle different innovations in different ways or work under different mandates or missions. So without further ado then, Jim, why don't I pass it over to you and you can go through the recommendations.
Great, thanks, Kellyx. I'm glad you came back, and frankly, there's no way I could have done what you just did, so phew. Again, I'm happy to be here. I'm going to take about 15 or so minutes to kind of talk through the recommendations and give you guys a sort of a high-level overview. I do want to reiterate, Kellyx just made the comment about the fact that the concepts of intra and interagency collaboration, as well as better coordination and collaboration between sort of project applicants / project designers and agency staff, was really front and center in a lot of discussions. And it really kind of permeates all of the recommendations. It's infused in all of them. And in fact, I think Kellyx and I would, as well as the Secretary, would strongly agree that it's essential to the success of this effort as a whole. And really, that's sort of intentional and proactive engagement. We see that as an opportunity to really unleash the creative energy and expertise of resource agency staff and ensure a constant exchange of really good ideas, technologies, and approaches. It's sort of foundational to develop restoration project stewardship practices that maximize multiple benefits and minimize any potential impacts. So it can't be overstated how important that concept is. So again, I'm going to go through the 14 recommendations that came out of that crazy word cloud that Kellyx showed earlier. And I'm going to link those with the January 7th memo that Secretary Crowfoot put out to leaders in California about implementation actions. As the slide shows, these 14 recommendations really fit into a couple different bins. We tried to bin these to kind of help things be a little bit more cohesive. We have about 5 recommendations that talk about improving small habitat restoration projects, those pathways. We've got 5 recommendations that really look at larger habitat restoration projects. We have some efficiencies for the coastal zone, efficiencies related to sort of stream flow, groundwater recharge, water rights, and also just permit application process. And I guess one thing I'll just mention for those of you that are going to spend time perusing the Cutting Green Tape report, each of the recommendations, the section about that recommendation is broken down into sort of, or divided into 3 components. There's a section that identifies the challenges and the approaches we heard, so it really provides sort of context. There's a second section that clearly articulates a proposed solution, and Kellyx just talked to you about how we sort of thought about the default solutions. And then the third section in each of those really provides some additional details, considerations that came out of these discussions. So sometimes it was a secondary idea or some corroborating thoughts that we really wanted to make sure didn't get lost. So as you peruse the document, just be aware of that. I think you'll find that very helpful. So I'm going to jump in first to the small scale efficiencies. Really, this focuses and builds on all the great existing work that has made permitting of small restoration projects substantially easier, decreased costs for practitioners and for the state for that matter, reduced staff time to process permits, and really enabled projects to get done faster. This includes, I think, 3 really specific mechanisms. One is the CEQA categorical exemption, number 33, for small habitat restoration projects. The second is the state board's general order, or sort of programmatic 401 certification, you might call it, for small habitat restoration projects. And the third is the Department Fish and Wildlife's Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act. The recommendations in this section really, they do three things. They ensure that these approaches work as intended. So for example, providing clarification on the language and intent in the categorical exemption, excuse me. They enable consistency across these three tools. So for example, having a consistent definition of small projects versus having additional limitations placed on a project. So the 5-acre limitation that's in CEQA, have that sort of be the consistent limitation across the tools. And also, where appropriate, broaden the reach of these tools, whether that's ensuring that something like fully protected species can be covered under HREA, the Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act, or whether it's enabling projects to be able to utilize HREA or the general order, regardless of the funding source. And I won't do a whole lot of quoting from the Secretary's memo, but recommendation 1 in the CGT report and action item 1 in Secretary Crowfoot's memo, I think is really an example of direct and immediate impact. I'm going to read this to folks, and sorry if you've already read it. This is a direct quote. All entities within the Natural Resource Agency should review their own procedures for CEQA implementation and, as necessary, clarify that the presence of endangered, rare, or threatened species or the use of mechanized equipment, respectively, does not preclude application per se of CEQA guideline class 33 categorical exemption for small habitat restoration projects, and staff should make every effort to use this action where appropriate. That's just a great example of how the Landscape Stewardship Network and the Secretary and his support, Undersecretary Norris, are working hand in glove to really try to implement these recommendations immediately. Okay, so I'm going to move on to efficiencies for large-scale projects. And let me remind everybody that we'll have a question and answer. So if I go through this quickly, there'll be time for us to have some clarifications. I think the importance of working at a landscape at an ecological scale has become widely recognized as critical for meaningful restoration and stewardship of our resources. Larger projects that address multiple benefits are absolutely essential for effectively addressing the challenges that are coming our way. Those challenges like resilience to climate change, connectivity and landscape permeability, recovery of species throughout their ranges. I mean, these are things that, yes, they require projects, but they also require a really big lens and a landscape lens. Many of the existing efficiencies that are already in place, the ones I just spoke about, are really focused on smaller projects. While we really have proof of concept, to date, there really are fewer tools at our disposal for working at a larger, more ecologically appropriate scale. The recommendations in this bin really focus on that larger projects. Recommendations range from continuing support and collaboration on the state board's general order and programmatic CEQA process for larger restoration projects, which is moving forward at this time, to consideration of expanding the use of the Department of Fish and Wildlife's existing programmatic approvals that were developed for their fisheries restoration grant program. Can we expand those to non-funded fisheries projects? So it's that sorts of larger scale recommendations. Recommendations also include the department creating a companion authorization to the state board's forthcoming general order for larger restoration projects, as well as potentially modifying 2 existing CEQA exemptions that were developed to assist regulatory agencies in implementing actions to improve natural resources. That's class 7 and 8. Secretary Crowfoot's January 7th memo highlights some immediate opportunities for both CDFW and the Resources Agency to begin assessing implementation of a subset of these recommendations immediately. So that's really exciting. And again, that's at a much larger scale. So we also have recommendations for the coastal zone. I think, as we all know, the coastal zone is unique. It has very special protections, both for ecological resources as well as for other resources that extend well beyond natural resources, including public access, protection of view sheds, etc. The California Coastal Act is managed through an incredibly diverse and complex set of agencies and governance. We've got the California Coastal Commission, we have the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and then approximately 126 local coastal programs, making approaches to efficiencies uniquely complicated. The Coastal Commission also has a draft strategic plan that identifies a number of aspirations that really might be supported by cutting green tape. And that's a really nice landing place for the commission and commission staff to start digging into cutting green tape. The cutting green tape recommendations really focus on opportunities for the commission to utilize existing tools within their existing authorities that could accelerate permitting of restoration actions, both big and small, along California's coast. So that's a kind of very focused recommendation for the coastal zone. We also provide recommendations for enhanced stream flow and groundwater recharge. This recommendation really is put in place to help provide a more clear framework to support and empower staff from the state board as well as CDFW who are dedicated to protecting and conserving surface and groundwater resources through the water rights process. It focuses on enabling them to better coordinate, prioritize, and advance critical work that really supports our stream flow projects and groundwater dependent ecosystems through groundwater management. And again, Action 5 in the Secretary's memo speaks directly to this recommendation. So that's sort of within the world of flows and water rights. The final bin is really about permit applications. And there really are two recommendations that we put forth here. And they're really to consolidate, coordinate, and streamline permit applications and tracking processes. One of the recommendations focuses more specifically on small habitat projects, and the other is more broadly applicable to all restoration projects. This really sounds easy. Oh, we'll just make a permit application. But really, we recognize that as much as it sounds simple, it's actually not simple. Particularly in the world of an online portal and online tracking process, there are many IT, security, and other systems considerations that compound the complexity here. And additionally, if we wanted to work at the state and federal level, there's an additional layer of security and IT issues related to federal systems integration. That said, COVID has forced many of our state, local, and federal agencies to expedite adoption of online permit portals and applications. And this situation may be a silver lining and may create conditions that enable a more cost-effective and rapid implementation of either one or both of these recommendations. And again, Action 6 in the Secretary's memo speaks directly to this. So that's sort of, I think, a high-level overview of what's in the CGT document and the Secretary's memo. And I think with that, I'm somehow losing my voice here. I will hand it back to Kellyx. Let her close things out here. Kellyx, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. I was saying thank you to you. I think that's a really good summary. And I understand that not everybody in this webinar is going to read the document, but I think a lot of people are interested, and that's a nice high-level review of it. So I wanted to touch a little bit on the road ahead. What's coming up? How does this get implemented? How's this going to manifest in California? So of course, the paper provides a well-vetted set of recommendations, but our paper is not the Cutting Green Tape initiative. That is an initiative of the California Resources Agency and partnership and with support of these other agencies. But there are also a lot of people around the state who are working towards this shared goal, some of whom are calling it cutting green tape and some of whom aren't. So the recommendations offer a path forward, but making them happen is going to require a lot of partnership. People with different authorities, different missions, different mandates, working toward a vision of getting our lands cared for, our lands and our resources cared for. The Resources Agency and the governor's executive order has committed to advance cutting green tape efforts. They've done that in writing and in person and in myriad ways, including implementation of relevant recommendations from the report. And they've asked for coordination with partners within and outside of government. So the Resources Agency is going to convene a meeting this spring to share their progress, ideas, and discuss ideas and how we can all move forward together. And as Jim mentioned, we were very excited that the Secretary Crowfoot released a memo actually implementing the first recommendation and starting to develop a roadmap for some of these other recommendations. And some of the recommendations that are in the report are also being advanced currently right now by our partners at Sustainable Conservation and also with the State Water Resources Control Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We at the California Landscape Stewardship Network are particularly interested in learning from existing efforts. I mentioned that before, and new efforts through case studies and otherwise. And we're also intending for future phases of cutting green tape to tackle other thorny issues and develop recommendations for things like data sharing across jurisdictions, funding collaboration, funding capacity, funding efficiencies, and cross-jurisdictional collaboration so that we can, meet this moment. So that is our sort of overview of the effort. We're going to shift to questions and answers. I wanted to suggest that folks take a screenshot or take a photo with your camera of these individuals who might be resources for you. I am a good point of contact for the work that the California Landscape Stewardship Network is doing. My email address is with my much more than day job at the Resource Conservation District. And there's a website there, which is the California Network's website for the Cutting Green Tape Initiative that includes the white paper that we wrote in 2019 assessing existing efforts and identifying some gaps, as well as the current paper, as well as the notes from all of the roundtables, as well as YouTube videos or online videos of the various webinars that we've provided on this. And presumably this one will be made available to you as well. Deputy Secretary Norris at the California Natural Resources Agency is the person who is charged with this roadmap from the governor to accomplish biodiversity goals. And she sees cutting green tape as an essential part of that. And she is the person in the Resources Agency charged with implementing cutting green tape. Their webpage also has the memo that Secretary Crowfoot just released that begins to implement some of these recommendations where he has authority. And then Sustainable Conservation, which I've referenced a few times, is a nonprofit organization that works in California, as its name applies, to accomplish sustainable conservation. And they've been a key entity in creating many of the programmatic and legislative tools that currently exist, and they've got more underway. And for those who aren't as familiar with some of these tools, on their website, there are technical resources, and they have a list of all of the tools that are available to you currently to try to accelerate restoration. So before we go into the questions and answers, I wanted to ask you all to go back to the poll everywhere poll that we had. Maybe it was poll everywhere that made me crash before. So you know what? I'm not going to use it. I will close the screen, and Jim and I can just be available for questions and discussion that come up in the chat box. So if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to discuss, go ahead and put it in the questions bar.
Kellyx, there's probably an easy one that came early on, which is, will this webinar be available for viewing and listening? I think Trish can probably answer that, but it is being recorded, so I don't know where it will be available, and I think Trish might be able to provide that information.
Yeah, it's being recorded, and we will post it on the Coastal Conservancy website, where we have several webinars posted, and then it sounds like it will also be linked on the Stewardship Network's site.
Yes, I hope so. That'll be our intent. Okay, so just making sure if everybody's got the questions, they can start rolling in if you have questions. Oh.
Well, do you know what? I was able to get that up. So if people can go to that poll everywhere and put in one word that describes what you hope that cutting green tape will accomplish. We're interested in knowing a little bit about where you're coming from on this, what your priorities and hopes are as we move forward in our work and as you move forward in your work. So a lot of people want to get stuff done, get it implemented, saving things about efficiency, saving money, simplicity, some that are more operational, some that are more about the outcome, habitat, restoration, stream flow, biodiversity. That's what people kind of want to get done. I see some things here more also about concerns, you know, and like wanting to maybe some concerns about being penalized, looking for culture shift, coordination, collaboration, overall resiliency, a lot around efficiency to implement restoration.
Kellyx are also to be clear and clarity and some stuff like that. Looking for some guidance.
Yeah, yeah, some certainty, clarity. That's part of the collaboration that's coming up a lot. Yeah, this is great. So while this is still coming up on the screen, why don't we see if anybody has any questions?
There's a couple key things I could just jump on right now, Kellyx, to help out.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the question box where I am. Maybe you can say what the questions are, Jim. None are coming up for me.
Okay, well, there was a question about sharing the link to the Secretary's memo, and that's already now put into the chat. So David Yao asked that question, so that's been answered. Let me read a question from Leslie Koenig to you, okay, Kellyx?
Sure.
Has there been any evaluation as to how management and maintenance of wetland and in-stream habitats could also be streamlined in addition to restoration? These riparian wetland resources provide opportunities to improve habitat conditions for special status species within urban and urban-rural interfaces, but implementation and maintenance actions are impacted by the hurdles of permitting and mitigation.
You know, Jim, Trish, I wanted to let you know that I'm getting some texts on my phone from people who are on this webinar who are saying that they can't see the questions bar. So maybe we can have people put it in.
The audience only has one thing that they can write in. So if they have something to write in, you can write in that. On some devices, the questions is just a question mark. It doesn't say the word questions.
Okay, so whatever you've got, go ahead and drop it in and we'll try to answer it. So Jim, can you summarize what that question was? And
this question really had to do with projects. I think what I understand is she's asking about projects that are sort of maintenance and management projects in sensitive habitats that are really maybe aren't explicitly restoration, but have the benefit of providing significant benefits to sensitive species, et cetera. And so she's asking,
right.
It sounds a little bit like that gray area between like what is restoration and what are practices that provide restoration benefits.
Right. Well, so cutting green tape is not about restoration. It's about environmental benefit. So if a project is environmentally beneficial, that's what we were considering. And that can include a myriad aspects of landscape stewardship. So if a project is an environmentally beneficial project, presumably it would be able to access some of the tools that are available and pathways to accomplish environmental benefit.
And I guess one thing I would add, Kellyx, is that I think one of the discussions that's come up is the inherent fact that projects are multiple benefit. And so sometimes just because a project has multiple benefits doesn't mean it's not about improving the environment. So I hope that answers your question.
There's another question that this is exciting stuff. What's going to be the best way to track progress with the directives and the memo from Secretary Crowfoot? I think that one key way to do that is to engage with the, there's a spring meeting and the resources agency is committed to some form of regular reporting out and connecting with people. You can use my contact information to find out more about that, or you can contact Deputy Secretary Norris about that.
Kellyx, there's also a question about supporting this. Who can they write letters of support to? I'm guessing that would be Under Secretary Norris, and is that correct? And
Deputy Secretary Norris. They can write to Deputy Secretary Norris or to Secretary Crowfoot, or if they're pleased with the governor's executive order, I'm sure that they could acknowledge that to the governor's office as well, or their own constituencies. I think that everybody on this call has their own networks and communities and constituencies with which they work, the extent to which they can communicate about these efforts and the need to care for our lands differently. That would probably be beneficial as well.
So Kellyx, we got a question about suggestions about what's beneficial for projects planning to go to construction in 2021, which is a great and of course timely question. I don't know if you want to or you want me to take that, but
well, I think one of those things is if you go to the web page with the resources that Sustainable Conservation has listed, that will describe to you everything that that currently exists, the existing pathways to be able to take advantage of efficiencies in getting projects permitted.
And I will say, I think the one thing that sort of is an immediate benefit is that CEQA exemption, which has, hasn't been applied as broadly and effectively due to some of the concerns about the language in there. And I think the Secretary is sort of taking care of that. So that's an immediate benefit that can be applied or accrued for projects going in 2021. Kellyx, there's also a question about local agencies and how did we, at the stakeholder meetings, and this is a great question, so I want to take.
Yeah, so that was, when Jim talked about the Coastal Act, how the Coastal Act in particular has such, diffuse implementation. When with all the different jurisdictions and counties and that sort of thing. And while it's true that our focus was on where there was opportunity with the state, as opposed to with individual counties and with federal agencies, et cetera. It's also true that that a lot of our conversation was about how some of these things, some of these projects really faced really different challenges at very local levels. And some of the recommendations will be helpful, I think, for folks at the local level. So for example, this clarity around when you can use CEQA exemptions for small scale habitat restoration. Sometimes one of our findings in the paper that we wrote in 2019 was that there wasn't always a shared understanding of what that exemption said and its purpose. And so we found people having difficulties using it locally. So that's one recommendation that's already been implemented that ought to be helpful for people. Other than that, we did not take on like a county by county or super regional approach or super local approach to understand the different issues that people faced. Anything you would add to that, Jim?
I would just say that it was identified, there was a recommendation to work at the county level. There's a complete acknowledgement. And I think, as Kellyx said, there were issues at the local level, there were issues at the federal level, and the work that we kind of focused on for this aspect of cutting green tape was really the state level. I think that's the next step. And I think, the last thing I'll just say about this, I think one of the things that we see, those of us who work in multiple jurisdictions across the state, is they have wildly different both local ordinances as well as planning processes. And so there's not really a one size fits all, but there are a lot of options for the state to take leadership. And I think that's what Secretary Crowfoot's trying to do, is taking leadership on being aspirational and kind of providing that path for people to take, to really move these projects forward. Kellyx, there's a question about mitigation banks. I think we can quickly answer that. There wasn't a tremendous.
What is the question, Jim?
The question is, sorry, did you consider regulatory processes for efficiently setting up banks? And that really, I think it came up in discussion, but it never got a lot of traction in this particular set of discussions. Doesn't mean it. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Kellyx.
Yeah, I would add to that. There was definitely consideration of mitigation banking and a specific recommendation that touches on that talks about making sure that that projects that are mitigation related, that they still have access to some of these efficiencies. So there's some specific recommendation that, not about setting up mitigation per se, but about making sure that mitigation, if it's environmentally beneficial, isn't precluded from some of these efficiencies. That's in the paper. I think that there are many more recommendations out there that aren't in this paper. What we focused on was what this paper does is it reflects back where there was some pretty broadly held recommendations that were advanced. Are they things that are going to have significant resource benefit across a significant geography, around a significant issue, or there's significant stakeholder interest around it? There were a number of other individual topics that came up that undoubtedly could have some real natural resource benefit that aren't necessarily reflected in these recommendations. And so that didn't come up in this process at all. And so it's not in the recommendations, but there's nothing saying that other good ideas can't come up throughout. The idea, ultimately, fundamentally, what we're talking about is a different way of thinking, having different systems to allow innovation, to harness our creativity, our passion, our courage to meet this moment. And this paper isn't the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of the conversation. And so if there are ideas and people do have the energy, and the inclination, please keep bringing these ideas forward. Share them with us or with the other partners or with the Deputy Secretary or wherever there's an avenue for you to share those ideas so that we can accomplish what we need to.
So Kellyx, there's another question here. It's someone who's been stymied a number of times trying to do fuel reduction and prescribed burns due to restrictions by the California Air Resources Board. And this person wants to know if CARB is being pulled in as a stakeholder.
Yeah, so let me answer that first by saying that remember the bookends on this process was that this wasn't about every beneficial resource management project that exists. So there are a lot of things that can, must, should be done in the management of our natural resources, but we were focused on the things that had a specific sort of direct environmental outcome benefit, like restoration or that sort of thing. There are other essential things that these lands need to be managed for that can also have environmental implications, like fuel load reduction or wildfire risk. In this paper, we were really going for the things, the sort of absolute no regrets environmentally projects. These are the things that we didn't have to have the conversation about whether or not it was environmentally beneficial or not, et cetera. Just, we started from a place of, let's remove the barriers, the environmental barriers to doing environmental projects. That doesn't mean that there can't be other conversations about those things as well. At the same time that we were working on this, the state was working on the Vegetative Treatment Program, EIR, which has come out and some of us are starting to use, and other things. I don't know the extent to which the Air Resources Board was engaged in some of those other efforts, but that wasn't something that we did in this.
So Kellyx, we have another question. You'll enjoy this one. Could blanket provisions be put in place, like the need for coastal development permits for typical invasive plant management projects?
Could blanket provisions be put in place for coastal development permits? Is that it?
Yeah, for typical invasive plant projects.
For invasive plant projects. And why do you say I would like that one
Well,
particularly?
just all the eucalyptus work that that you've been involved in.
Yeah, so could they? The question is, could they? So I'll answer it literally, and then I'll answer it with what I want to say. So literally, could they? I don't know. We did not lead with feasibility or lead with constraints, and we led with aspiration and the need for courage and for new ways of thinking. So are there new ways of thinking around that? Undoubtedly, there could be. And I think there's opportunities. There continue to be opportunities to bring that into any of these needs into the conversation. And we do have a recommendation in there that's about essentially how to. You asked specifically about coastal development permits, about what opportunities might be with the Coastal Commission specifically. There isn't a specific recommendation about that in the paper, but the paper is reflecting back what came up from people during this process.
Okay, I've got another good question for you, Kellyx. Oh, they're all good questions. This is a development permits and the commission. Does the Coastal Commission have the tools and discretion to support and accelerate permit applications before formal regulatory changes can be made in alignment with CEQA CADX 33 and HREA for small projects?
Yeah, I think who asked that question?
David, I want to make sure I pronounce his name right. It's SHPAK.
Okay. Jim, would you like to field that one, and we could talk about what the recommendation is regarding the Coastal Commission or the different tools that might be available?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are a number of tools available to the commission, and there's also a number of tools available to the public to work directly with the commission to make requests. At this point in time, the commission, I think, because of the California Coastal Act being so sacred a law, it's been a little bit of a red herring to try to figure out how to open up the California Coastal Act for anybody and make amendments to it. It's a very important, it's a critical law for protecting our coast. And so, like Kellyx said earlier, the default in most of this was how do we work with existing regulations and through staff to make changes. So I think there are opportunities. Maybe I'll let Kellyx kind of get into the weeds if she dares do so.
Well, there's a couple things. One is that when we read the Coastal Commission's new, I think it's still in draft form, I'm not sure, the strategic plan, it seemed like there was a lot of opportunity for utilizing existing pathways and existing tools that they have to accelerate accelerate restoration and environmentally beneficial projects. So, where we landed in our recommendation was with that. I know that Coastal Commission is having conversations with CDFW right now about where there can be some alignment, where they can use their existing authorities to get projects done. I know that this isn't restoration per se, but I know that we've been working with Coastal Commission on where there can be concurrence with the EIR for the VTP for fuel load reduction projects. And also, certainly we work a lot with the consistency determinations that the Coastal Commission has made with programmatic biological opinion of NOAA that's managed by the Restoration Center. So there are definitely there are pathways that can be utilized.
Yeah, and I think this is a place where there's a lot more discussion to happen. I think, as Kellyx said earlier, this is the beginning of a discussion, not the end. And I think the commission is engaged and eager to figure out how to be a really active partner in this.
And I should also note that that was a common theme that came up in the process. A lot of people trying to figure out how, given that the Coastal Act affords special protections in the coastal zone. The coastal zone is also a place where a lot of work needs to happen. How are we going to get it done? There seems to be a lot of energy around that, and I expect that conversation really to continue to moving forward.
Let me ask the next question, Kellyx. Did your report provide any recommendations for creating greater efficiencies for post-project monitoring requirements, parentheses tied to permits, that tend to greatly escalate restoration costs?
Well, Jim, do you want to talk about how that conversation came up in the process, or?
I was kind of hoping I was kicking it over to you.
Yeah, I can. So the short answer is that that some of these, it depends on the tool that's being proposed in the report. So some of these tools are exemptions, and some of them are reduced burdens in different ways. Or some of them are programmatic in nature, so it sort of aggregates or shifts some of the responsibility. But that it definitely came up that I think that this came up more, frankly, in the 2019 white paper than it does in this current report. Because one of the things that we assessed in the 2019 white paper was whether or not, or the extent to which existing efficiencies are functioning as intended. And we found that the efficiencies can be gutted in how they're interpreted, how they're implemented, or what happens after the fact. And I often describe trying to get projects done as death by 1,000 paper cuts. You've got these dynamic natural systems, and then you've got some, really like complex funding pieces that have to fit together. And then you have very disparate regulatory requirements for implementation and monitoring, which is often unfunded after a project. And it takes some wizardry to get those lined up, and then make sure that you're actually getting the projects done that are the biggest priorities, not just the ones that are the most feasible with all those different timelines. So there isn't a specific recommendation about monitoring requirements, but I think the theme is, let's make this easier. Let's make it possible to get things done and make it cost effective. And there are probably times when monitoring requirements are part of making sure that we're doing the best thing for the resource and learning from it, and we need to have that funded. And then there might be times that could be easier, but it's not a specific recommendation in the report.
And I would just echo, Kellyx said early on in the webinar that cutting green tape, right now we're focused on regulatory efficiencies. There's a whole parallel effort about funding. And I think that will play into this, because a lot of our restoration projects that many of us do are grant funded, and this becomes a real problem. It's a funding problem, and making sure good science gets done, but effectively. So there's another question, Kellyx. Can you explain further how changes in use of CEQA exemption 7 and 8 would happen? I can take that if you want.
Sure.
So CEQA exemption classes 7 and 8, as you may or may not know, are specific exemptions for regulatory agencies to implement generally natural resource projects, beneficial projects. But both of those exemptions have a clause in them that basically says that they don't cover construction. We did a fair amount of work to try to figure out the genesis of the language in those exemptions. It is a little difficult due to how old they are. But the bottom line is what came out of the roundtables was a number of state regulatory agencies requesting that Natural Resource Agency and OPR look at this and see about defining, either removing the restriction against construction, or defining construction and defining restoration work outside of traditional construction work. So this actually is both in the Cutting Green Tape report, as well as it is articulated in Secretary Crowfoot's memo. So both of those links we have in the chat. You can get a little bit more information, and if you want more, obviously Kellyx provided the names of people you can reach out to. But I hope that answers that question. Kellyx, do you want to add anything there or no?
No, that's great. Thank you, Jim. And I see that we're coming up to 12:15. So since I unfortunately can't see the questions, can you tell me, are there a number of them, or is this a good time for us to kind of wrap up?
There's like 7 or 8 more questions.
Then let's go ahead and let's stick it out for folks who want to drop off. They can. I see some have. And for folks who want to ask questions, I'd love for us to stay and answer those questions for you. For those who are leaving, I just want to say again, thank you for your time and for your investment today, and for the perspective that you've offered in this word cloud, and your patience with me as I had to leave and come back, and I'm sure that was a bit disjointed. I hope that it's still been helpful and informative and meaningful. By all means, please do follow up with any of the resources that we posted on that last slide. So then, Jim, what was the next question then?
It's about the regional water quality control boards, basically that they have both sort of federal and state jurisdiction because of 401. And the water board permitting is currently a slow process and could definitely use some attention. The new core rule will help with some of this, but it's a question about sort of our engagement with the regional boards.
So the question is, did we engage? Yes, we spoke with a number of people from regional water quality control boards, and of course with State Water Resources Control Board. And so yes, they were certainly at the table. They have access. There's the existing general order for small habitat restoration projects. The state board is developing the new general order for larger habitat restoration projects. So yes, we definitely have been working with them. I think that I also just want to take this moment to honor the hard work of the folks in these agencies who, and just maybe also reflect what we've heard from some of them in some of these conversations about their need for adequate resources to be able to do this work, their desire to be able to engage early on and have right fitting regulations. And another thing that we heard, this is not a direct answer, this is not an answer to that question, but I want to note it anyway, is one of something that was told us that really stuck out to me was that, someone told me you're doing optional restoration, you're doing it where there are these opportunities or what have you. It's not optional for us to implement these mandates. And the buck stops with us. And I think a lot of people are perceiving it as the buck stops with them. There are a lot of these people from these agencies, there's some particular, concern that it's been on their watch for decades, and they're watching it slip through their fingers regardless of their work. So, so there's a lot of concern about doing it right. And then the other thing that we've talked about is what is the cost to shift one's mindset from applying statute to getting projects done? And what are the things that really require new resources for agency staff to be able to get projects reviewed and make sure that project requirements are consistent across different permits? And what is and isn't required? How much, where do you need resources? Where do we not need new resources, et cetera?
Thanks. So this is a quick clarification. Someone asked if the paper that we're referring to is the November 2020 Cutting Green Tape Report, and the answer is yes. Then there's the January memo from Secretary Crowfoot, and Kellyx also mentioned the Shifting the Paradigm, our earlier white paper. It was 2019, Kellyx, am I right?
That's right. And all 3 of those documents are on the website. All of the documents we're talking about are on the California Landscape Stewardship Network's website. That was in that screen that I showed. I would show it again, but I'm afraid I'd make everything crash. So hopefully you all took that screenshot when I showed it. So if you go to the website for Cutting Green Tape via the California Landscape Stewardship Network, it has the original white paper from 2019 on shifting the risk paradigm. It has the report, which are the recommendations that we submitted to the Secretary from November. It has the Secretary's memo clarifying the CEQA exemption for habitat restoration, small scale habitat restoration, and also providing directives to staff and his agency to implement cutting green tape. It also has all of the notes from all of the meetings, the roundtables and that sort of thing, and the materials that we developed. It is, it's a pretty content-rich page. So anybody who really wants to drill down, it's great. Otherwise, contact me directly.
So Kellyx, here's another question. Little less on specifically our work, but maybe looking for a recommendation from us. In hold on, something just happened and I lost all the questions. Oh, they're back. In conversation with Monterey County, we were informed that restoration is not one of the priorities in their LCP. After trying to make the claim that our restoration activities were helping them meet their environmental goals, does this mean we need to change the LCP? I mean, that's a sort of not exactly in our wheelhouse, but an interesting question about sort of how local jurisdictions perceive ecological restoration and how it dovetails with their protective responsibilities.
You know, I don't know all the specifics and I'm not down in the weeds, but even if the LCP doesn't state restoration specifically, presumably the LCP states beneficial resources. I mean, I would imagine that the LCP has values that it's endeavoring to protect around threatened and endangered species or water quality or habitat or what have you, even if it doesn't say restoration specifically. So anyway, I don't know is the answer.
So there's another question here, which is a little confusing to me, and maybe we don't need to get into the weeds, but it's about FRGP, the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program. And the question says that you can't use their CEQA if the project is in a coastal zone, and FRGP, and therefore the FRGP programmatics aren't applicable in the coastal zone. I
think that's inaccurate.
I think that's inaccurate because we've used it many times in the coastal zone.
Yeah.
That's a question I don't think we have an answer to, but there may be some confusion there.
I've definitely used that in the coastal zone many times.
Yeah, me too.
This is Trish. I'll just add though that it doesn't remove the obligation to get a coastal development permit.
So it doesn't cover the coastal development permit.
That's right. It doesn't cover the coastal development permit, and also if there's fully protected species present, it doesn't cover fully protected species. So there might be CEQA that you need to do separately regarding fully protected species. So for example, in coastal San Mateo County, where we've accessed the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program and its programmatic permits, which we have found to be really beneficial for many of our projects, we've had to do some separate analysis for the San Francisco garter snake, for example. And yes, Trisha's right. It doesn't cover coastal development permits. Very often we find that the same projects that would be funded by the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program can be included in NOAA's programmatic biological opinion, which has a consistency determination with the Coastal Act, and so the coastal development permit is included through that programmatic biological opinion.
Yeah, and so that's maybe the most succinct answer is, if you run into this problem, call the NOAA Restoration Center, because they are a partial funder and are part of FRGP, and they have a federal consistency determination for the Coastal Act. We've got a BCDC question. Has BCDC, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, been participating in this effort? It seems like the update to specific sections of the Bay Plan could substantially increase the planning effort, cost, and timeline of restoration projects. That's the current update. And so, yes, I mean, BCDC has been at the table. They were at the roundtables and have been engaged and really, I think, eager to be a part of this. Kellyx, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah.
And we did hear from both the Delta Stewardship Council and BCDC about the plan update and their hopes that the plan update was really going to basically work hand in glove with cutting green tape. I personally have not been tracking that. So Renee, maybe that's an offline discussion. Okay, we only have a few questions left.
Tim, I just want to add that one of our goals with the California Landscape Stewardship Network is to keep learning. And I think one of the places where we can add value to the state and others who are implementing these efforts is by staying apprised of what's working and what isn't working. So we would really value hearing from you as we continue our learning and bring that into the conversation.
Can we have one last question, Kellyx? And now that I'm reading it, I'm not 100% sure I understand it. I know that sometimes the word count makes it hard. Can you delineate landscapes that support restoration projects, providing ecosystem services, and prioritize permitting and funding work in designated landscape units? I'm not 100% sure I understand that question. Maybe you do better than I.
If the person asking this question is talking about essentially regional planning and pre-permitting, like looking, one of the recommendations in the report, for example, is to have a CEQA alternative for large landscape scale efforts. So essentially delineating an area and developing a plan that goes across maybe jurisdictions, across boundaries, across properties, and enables CEQA permitting at a different scale within that area. So if that is what you're asking, that is touched on in the paper. I mean, it doesn't currently exist. It would need to be developed.
And Kellyx, that is, unless I missed something, which is very possible because there were a lot of questions, I think that's most, if not all, of the questions at this point. So the timing is perfect. It's 12:26.
Great. Well, then I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to all the people who joined us. Thank you to the Coastal Conservancy, Trish, for having us, for inviting us, and everyone's patience with us navigating, apparently sharing the airwaves with a couple of people in school. So thank you.
And let me say on behalf of the Conservancy and the whole audience, thank you very much to the two of you for this presentation, but also just all of the work that you have been doing to try to help us do this work more efficiently. You guys are rock stars. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Wow.